When you realize everyone is showing their patterns, the moment you start seeing, there comes a moment in your life when something shifts inside your perception. Nothing dramatic happens. No announcement. No revelation. But suddenly, the world begins to look different. You start noticing things you never noticed before. Not because people changed, but because you did. You begin to realize something unsettling. Everyone is showing their patterns. Every conversation, every reaction, every silence, every emotional outburst. It all begins to repeat. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Carl Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But when you begin observing people closely, you start to realize something even more disturbing. Most people are not choosing their behavior. They are repeating it. Again and again. Like a script they cannot stop performing. And the strange part is, they rarely know they are doing it. The hidden language of human behavior, when you first begin noticing patterns, it feels confusing. You might think you are becoming cynical, or judgmental, or even paranoid. But what is actually happening is much simpler. Your mind has started to observe behavior instead of words. And behavior never lies. People may tell you they are honest, but their patterns show deception. They may claim they care about you, but their patterns reveal indifference. They may promise change, but their patterns expose repetition. This is the moment psychological awareness begins, because the human personality is not random. It operates through loops, invisible loops, emotional loops, behavioral loops, and most people live inside these loops without ever recognizing them. For example, the friend who always apologizes but never changes, the coworker who constantly blames others for their mistakes, the partner who repeats the same conflict every few months. At first it looks like coincidence, but after a while, it becomes obvious. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. Why the mind repeats itself. The human brain loves familiarity, even when familiarity is destructive. Psychologists have long understood something strange about human behavior. People do not always repeat what makes them happy. They repeat what feels familiar. Someone raised around chaos often feels strangely comfortable inside chaos. Someone raised around criticism may seek partners who criticize them. Someone who learned manipulation early in life may unconsciously repeat it forever. Not because they want to hurt others, but because the mind memorized a script long ago, and scripts are difficult to break. This is why certain people always seem to encounter the same type of relationship, the same betrayal, the same arguments, the same emotional cycles. Their conscious mind wants something new, but their unconscious mind keeps selecting the familiar pattern, and this happens everywhere. In friendships, in families, in workplaces, in love. The moment you understand this, you begin to see human behavior differently. You stop reacting to isolated events, and you start observing patterns over time. The moment awareness begins, most people never reach this stage. They react emotionally to individual moments. They judge a person based on what they said today, or how they acted yesterday. But patterns reveal something much deeper. They show you who someone really is, not who they claim to be. Not who they wish they were, but who they consistently become when life repeats itself. And patterns rarely hide forever. Eventually they surface. A liar eventually lies again. A manipulator eventually manipulates again. A loyal person eventually proves loyalty again. A selfish person eventually reveals selfishness again. Because patterns are not accidents. They are the structure of personality. And once you start seeing this structure, the world becomes strangely predictable. You begin to notice small signals, tiny behaviors, subtle reactions, things that most people ignore. And suddenly, people's future behavior becomes easier to anticipate. Not perfectly, but often enough to surprise you. Because when someone shows you the same pattern 3, 4, 5 times, it is no longer a possibility. It is a blueprint. The quiet observer. There is a reason quiet people often understand human nature better than loud ones. Observation requires stillness, and stillness allows you to see repetition. When someone constantly talks, reacts, argues, or explains, they miss the deeper signals, but observers notice something others overlook. They notice tone changes. They notice hesitation. They notice inconsistencies. They notice emotional triggers. They notice who becomes defensive. They notice who becomes manipulative. They notice who becomes silent. They notice who becomes honest. These small moments form patterns, and patterns slowly reveal character. The strange thing is, once you start noticing these patterns, you rarely need to confront them. You simply understand them. You begin predicting reactions before they happen. You see conflicts forming before others notice. You recognize manipulation before it fully unfolds. And this realization changes the way you interact with people. Because when you understand patterns, you stop expecting people to behave outside of them. Why this realization feels uncomfortable? Awareness brings clarity. But clarity often feels uncomfortable because it forces you to accept a difficult truth. People rarely change quickly, not because change is impossible, but because patterns are deeply embedded inside identity. A person who has repeated the same emotional pattern for 20 years will not break it overnight, not because they refuse, but because the pattern feels natural to them. So when you begin recognizing these patterns, your expectations start to shift. You stop waiting for someone to suddenly become someone else. You stop trying to fix behavior that keeps repeating. You stop explaining the same boundary again and again. Instead, you start observing, and observation leads to a different kind of understanding, a quieter one, a deeper one. Because when you see patterns clearly, you no longer need endless explanations. You simply watch, and the pattern eventually reveals everything. The patterns people cannot hide. At first, when you begin noticing patterns in people, it feels like a strange new awareness. You simply observe behavior. You notice repetition. You see reactions forming before they fully appear. But as this awareness deepens, something even more unsettling begins to happen. You start noticing that certain patterns never change. Not because people lack intelligence, not because they lack good intentions, but because the human personality builds protective mechanisms around itself. And those mechanisms repeat over and over again. Carl Jung described this through the concept of the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask people present to the world. The shadow is everything hidden beneath that mask. And patterns are often the moment when the shadow leaks through. A person might present themselves as calm and reasonable, but under pressure, the same hidden reaction appears. Anger, defensiveness, control, withdrawal. The mask may change depending on the situation, but the pattern underneath remains surprisingly consistent. The pattern of defensiveness. One of the most common patterns you begin noticing is defensiveness. At first, it seems like a normal reaction. Someone feels criticized. Someone feels misunderstood. Someone feels attacked. But if you observe carefully, you begin to see something deeper. Some people are not reacting to what you said. They are reacting to what your words triggered inside them. You might calmly point out a small mistake, but suddenly the person becomes aggressive, or dismissive, or sarcastic, or emotionally distant. Why? Because the pattern already existed long before that moment. Certain individuals carry a deep internal sensitivity to criticism. Even when criticism is constructive, even when it is gentle, their mind instantly moves into defense. And this defense becomes predictable. They interrupt. They change the subject. They blame others. They reinterpret the situation. They twist the narrative. Not consciously, but automatically. It is a protective reflex. And once you see this pattern clearly, you stop arguing with it. Because arguing with a pattern rarely changes it. It only activates it more strongly. The pattern of manipulation. Another pattern becomes visible once you begin observing behavior over time. Manipulation rarely appears openly. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it reveals itself through repetition. Certain people repeatedly shift responsibility away from themselves. They subtly make others feel guilty. They present themselves as misunderstood victims. They exaggerate emotional reactions to control outcomes. They create confusion during conflict. And the fascinating part is that many manipulators do not see themselves this way. To them, their actions feel justified. They believe they are defending themselves, or protecting their interests, or correcting an unfair situation. But patterns expose the deeper structure. If someone consistently redirects blame, if they consistently distort events, if they consistently use emotion to influence others, then it is no longer a misunderstanding. It is a behavioral strategy. And strategies repeat again and again and again. Once you notice this repetition, manipulation becomes far easier to recognize. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet observation. The pattern of emotional cycles. Human relationships often operate in emotional cycles. You may have noticed this in certain friendships or romantic relationships. Everything seems calm, peaceful, even loving. Then suddenly tension appears. Arguments escalate, distance grows. Conflict intensifies. Eventually, there is reconciliation, apologies, promises. And for a short time, everything feels stable again. But after weeks or months, the same cycle begins again. At first, people interpret this as coincidence, but emotional cycles are rarely accidental. They are patterns rooted in psychological needs. Some individuals unconsciously create conflict because conflict feels familiar. Others repeat emotional drama because it brings attention and validation. Others fear stability and sabotage peaceful periods. And so, the cycle continues. The strange part is that both people inside the relationship may genuinely believe things will be different next time, but patterns have momentum. Without deep awareness, they continue repeating. The pattern of silence. Not all patterns are loud. Some are quiet. In fact, some of the most revealing patterns are silent ones. There are people who withdraw instead of communicating. People who disappear emotionally when things become difficult. People who avoid conflict entirely. At first, this behavior may appear peaceful or mature, but over time, a pattern emerges. Every uncomfortable conversation ends in silence. Every disagreement leads to distance. Every emotional confrontation is avoided. And eventually, the relationship becomes filled with unresolved tension. Because silence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own pattern. A pattern of avoidance, a pattern of emotional retreat. And once again, this pattern is rarely intentional. For many people, silence was the safest response they learned earlier in life. So when tension appears, the mind automatically chooses the familiar escape. Not discussion, not resolution, but disappearance. The pattern of false change. Perhaps the most confusing pattern people show is the pattern of false change. This is when someone sincerely promises transformation. They acknowledge mistakes. They apologize. They express understanding. They commit to improvement. And for a short time, things genuinely look different. Their behavior improves. Their attitude shifts. Their tone softens. But slowly, almost invisibly, the old pattern begins returning. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, until eventually, the same behavior appears again. And when you notice this pattern repeating several times, something becomes clear. The person is not lying about wanting to change, but wanting change is very different from rebuilding the pattern that controls behavior. Real change requires dismantling an entire psychological structure, and that structure often took decades to form, so promises alone cannot replace it. Without awareness and consistent effort, the old pattern quietly reclaims control. The strange calm of understanding patterns. When you first realize that everyone is showing their patterns, you may feel frustrated, even disappointed, because you begin to understand that many conflicts were predictable, many betrayals were predictable, many emotional reactions were predictable. But over time, this awareness produces a different feeling. Not anger, not judgment, but calm. Because patterns explain behavior that once felt confusing. Instead of asking, why did they suddenly act this way? You begin asking a different question. Have they acted this way before? And very often, the answer is yes. Patterns were already present. They simply had not been recognized yet. And once you see them clearly, the world becomes quieter. Not because people change, but because you stop expecting them to behave outside of their patterns. The final realization about human nature. After a while, something unexpected begins to happen. The more you observe patterns in others, the more you begin noticing patterns in yourself. And this is the moment where true awareness begins. Because it is easy to study the behavior of other people, it is much harder to examine the unconscious loops inside your own mind. Yet Jung believed that real psychological growth begins at exactly this point. Not when you expose the patterns of others, but when you recognize the ones operating within you, the pattern inside you. Think about your own life for a moment. The types of people you feel drawn to, the situations that repeatedly cause conflict, the emotional triggers that appear again and again. At first, these may look like unrelated events, but when you step back and observe your own behavior the same way you observe others, patterns begin to emerge. Perhaps you tend to trust people too quickly. Perhaps you avoid confrontation until problems explode. Perhaps you attract partners who require emotional rescue. Perhaps you remain in situations longer than you should. These patterns are not signs of weakness. They are psychological blueprints formed earlier in life. Experiences shape expectations. Expectations shape reactions. Reactions shape patterns. And those patterns quietly guide your decisions without you even realizing it. This is why Jung warned that what remains unconscious eventually controls us. Not because the unconscious is evil, but because it operates automatically. And automatic behavior becomes repetition. The moment of psychological maturity, there is a powerful shift that occurs when someone begins recognizing both sides of this truth. Not only the patterns in others, but the patterns within themselves. At that moment, the world stops feeling like a battlefield. Because you no longer see people simply as good or bad, right or wrong. You see them as psychological systems. Each person is carrying scripts. Some learned from childhood. Some learned through trauma. Some learned through survival. And these scripts operate silently beneath their behavior. When you see this clearly, something surprising happens. Your anger begins to fade. Not because the behavior becomes acceptable, but because it becomes understandable. A manipulator repeats manipulation because they learned it as protection. A defensive person reacts defensively because they fear exposure. A distant person withdraws because emotional closeness once felt dangerous. Patterns are not random choices. They are psychological survival strategies. Once you see that, you begin interacting with people differently. You stop expecting someone with a deeply ingrained pattern to suddenly act outside of it. You stop wasting energy trying to rewrite someone else's script. Instead, you make a different decision. You choose where to place your attention. The quiet power of awareness. One of the most interesting things about awareness is that it does not require confrontation. When you see someone's patterns clearly, you rarely need to argue about them. You simply stop participating in them. If someone constantly seeks conflict, you stop feeding the argument. If someone manipulates emotionally, you stop responding to the manipulation. If someone repeatedly breaks trust, you stop offering unlimited chances. This is not revenge. It is not punishment. It is psychological clarity. Patterns require participation to continue. Without participation, they weaken. But something even more interesting happens when you develop this awareness. People begin reacting differently to you. Manipulators struggle to influence you because you recognize their strategies early. Chronic arguers lose interest because their patterns no longer trigger emotional reactions. Drama loses its power because you no longer fuel it. Your calm observation becomes something unusual and sometimes unsettling because people who operate through unconscious patterns depend on predictable reactions. When those reactions disappear, the pattern loses its control. The final truth about human behavior. Eventually, after observing patterns long enough, one final realization emerges. Human behavior is rarely mysterious. It is repetitive. Not identical every time, but remarkably consistent over long periods. Someone's values show through their patterns. Someone's fears reveal themselves through their patterns. Someone's character becomes visible through their patterns. Words can hide many things, but patterns reveal them. Over time, patterns become more reliable than promises, more honest than explanations, more revealing than apologies. And once you understand this truth, your relationship with the world changes. You stop chasing explanations. You stop seeking endless clarity from conversations. Instead, you watch behavior, because behavior always tells the story eventually. The freedom of seeing clearly. This awareness may sound heavy at first, but in reality, it brings a strange kind of freedom. You stop feeling confused by repeated behavior. You stop questioning your intuition when patterns repeat. You stop waiting for someone to become someone they have never been. Instead, you learn to trust what you see, not with bitterness, not with cynicism, but with quiet understanding. Everyone is showing their patterns. Some reveal loyalty, some reveal kindness, some reveal manipulation, some reveal fear. And once you see those patterns clearly, the most powerful thing you can do is very simple. Believe him, not the words, not the promises, but the pattern. Because patterns rarely lie. And the moment you understand that, you stop reacting blindly to the world. You begin seeing it, and once you truly see human patterns, you move through life with a calm awareness that very few people ever develop. Not because you control others, but because you finally understand them. And that understanding changes everything.